Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to not the Brownlow is what it's called. My name's Sam Pang. I'm going to quickly get the panel out here. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Wheeler Centre and The Age, thank you for coming. We've got a nice little chat ahead. The format's supposed to be 45 minutes of us talking and then 15 minutes of you. Tim Lane has just suggested that if you do have a question at any time, just put your hand up and we'll turn it into Q&A. So if you'd like to do that, and if not, that's fine. You can wait till the end. I just wanted to say that in the brief, we're going to be talking about best and fairest. Does it still mean what it has always meant, or how has it changed? We will be covering that. We'll probably be covering a lot of other things too. So if you just came purely to get that question answered, you might be able to go after about 10 minutes. So I just wanted to take a moment and say what a year it's been in the AFL, 2013. So many issues, so many stories, so many lessons. And if we just take a moment to reflect, of course, Essendon just dominating the football landscape all year. Melbourne, who've recently had some good news with Paul Roos being announced as their coach, which I think is great, and hopefully that's put a dark period in that club's history behind them. And of course, just early last week at St Kilda, we finally had some resolution to one of the big a burning issue in AFL for as long as I've been following the game, and we finally got an official result there. Apparently, it is not all right to try to set fire to a dwarf. Up until then, it had been such a grey issue, by the way, so I'm glad we finally got some resolution there. Let's get the panel up here. Our first guest is, you all know him as a doyen of football and cricket commentary for the last 20 or 30 years. I know him as a poor man's Drew Morfitt. Please welcome Tim Lane. As Tim takes a seat, I just want to introduce our guest number 2. She is the coach of the Western Bulldogs women's team. She is the backline coach at the Port Melbourne Football Club in the VFL, and she's a 5-time premiership coach of the Darebin Dragons. Please welcome Peta Searle to the stage. I mentioned Drew Morfitt earlier. He was once described as a poor man's Jake Niall. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Niall. So there you have it. Tim, welcome.
Where's Drew, Sam?
Drew's out parking Jake's car, so he'll be in later on. What's Drew like? I'm going to ask the tough questions first, Tim.
Oh dear, he's not quite what he was. I knew Drew when he was much younger, and didn't marry until he was in his early 40s, and boy, he travelled a few miles, let me tell you.
What a frightening thought to begin the night, Tim. Jake, welcome. First time at the Wheeler Centre, or?
First time at this part of the Wheeler Centre. Hopefully not the last.
Well, if you keep being obscure like that, it will be the last, mate. And Peter, we should actually just start with the Darebin Falcons.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that dynasty?
Yes, that was my first coaching gig. I used to play for the club, and then they needed a coach the year that I retired, and they convinced me to come down and coach, and they hadn't played finals for 10 years, and in terms of culture and spectators and getting people to watch the game, they weren't really a favourable club. So I certainly had my work cut out for me, but the first year I went there, we actually made the grand final, and then after that we won the last 5 finals. So it was a pretty when you're in the moment you don't really appreciate it, but now that I've walked away from the club I can really sit back and enjoy the time and realise the magnitude of what it's like to win 5 consecutive finals.
Tim, we should start with the actual, what it says in the program. You've been covering the game for so long. Best and fairest in 2013 across any form of the game that you want. Does it still mean the same?
Probably not. I mean, I think almost everyone is a fair player these days. And even when it comes to the Brownlow, I've always greatly admired Neil Roberts' position on the Brownlow, where he said he would hand his back if the AFL ever took the fairest criterion out of it. But I reckon it's almost getting to the point where he'd have to think a little more about it rather than being a knee-jerk reaction, at least. For example, if Buddy Franklin did what he did last Friday night in a home and away game and it cost him the Brownlow medal, I'd say that would be almost an injustice, because the sorts of things that players do get scrubbed for now, and it may be reasonable that they do, but it's also reasonable that the penalties tend to be of the order of 1 and 2 weeks by and large, because there is nothing like the biff and clout and thuggery of the old days. It is a much cleaner game. The players are professional. I mean, they still have to be just as courageous, because it's faster and less predictable in many ways than it ever was. But everyone goes out and focuses on the ball, and they're not allowed to indulge themselves in moments of ridiculous retaliation. And here we were with Heath Shaw, who did put on a bit of a scene last Saturday night. And, we all agreed it was pretty outrageous and terribly undisciplined, whereas in the old days, being undisciplined involved swinging one from the 2 bob seats rather than just shoving the ball into an opponent's face.
Peter, you as one of the actual, you have some currency in the game in terms of you are coaching. Best and fairest, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, look, it's interesting, because I think best and fairest basically is awarded to what it is defined as. And if you actually look up Wikipedia, the definition goes something along the lines of it's for best performance over a year in a competition or club without being suspended or without misconduct. So when you look at that, you're looking at the word fairest in an already negative way rather than the word fairest in a positive way, in perhaps the behaviours they should be demonstrating rather than the behaviours that they're not demonstrating. So in light of that, and when you vote, because at the end of each game the coaches have to vote, when you vote you actually look at those who have had the greatest influence on the game. So, and that might not necessarily be the fairest person in your team, but in terms of looking at how they shaped and formed the win or the loss in the game, you look at voting for them. So I think it replicates what the definition is, but for me personally, I think best plus fairest should equal the best, and you really need to look at the selection criteria of fairest. And interesting enough, I went to the Western Bulldogs best and fairest on Wednesday night, and Ryan Griffiths, fair enough, he had a great season, he won it. But Brendan McCartney introduced an award, and I'm not quite sure whether the award was there earlier or whether he's reintroduced it or whether it's new at AFL level, but it's certainly an award that we have all, as coaches, as mums and dads of junior levels and so forth, we've always engaged in it, and it's the Coaches Award. Now, if I was a player, I'd love to get the Coaches Award, or perhaps, the award voted by their peers. And so Will Minson won the Coaches Award. And I was thinking the next day on SEN, do you think they would mention that Will Minson won the Coaches Award, or do you think it's the best and fairest that gets mentioned? So, if you want to create a more fairness just to it, I think, it takes a whole cultural shift, not just I guess what the end result is, but what you want to hear from the media and so forth.
It's an interesting point you bring up about awards, new awards. My mother, when she used to watch me play as a junior, was ahead of her time. She went to the coach and asked for a new award, the slowest and worst, and she really wanted her child to get a trophy come presentation night. Jake, after listening to these two, your thoughts?
Well, the Brownlow, just fairest and best anachronism. The whole Brownlow is now an anachronism, really, and a great one and a terrible one when you consider we have now the MVP coming in, and Gary Ablett's won the MVP of the competition 5 times, and his stature is by far the greatest of any player in the game. It's unusual you'd have a player who's unanimously viewed as the best player in the game, and that's pretty much been unanimous for quite a while. That MVP award has really risen. And I wonder, it's a very American concept of the idea of the most valuable player as distinct from the fairest and best. The Brownlow exists as a ceremony like the Grammys or something. It's a ceremonial thing, and it's also a bit of a throwback because they vote 3-2-1. When you vote, like we in the Age, we vote out of 10, and we give 5 players votes, which is closer to the reality of how coaches would view a game, I assume, Peter. So the Brownlow is also anachronistic in that players get terribly drunk, and there's sort of a 1970s style objectification of women. A lot of things that football, ironically, the game itself has moved into more. I think it's evolved into a more woman-friendly, a more ethnically conscious, etc., etc. It's become more socially conscious, and yet the Brownlow sits there as something like a legacy of the past in many ways.
Are you referring to the year where the wives and girlfriends had to parade around on a luggage carousel from the airport? Are you saying that was a bad thing, Jake?
No, I'm not saying. I'm just saying it's got this element of they have the red carpet and they have this.
It was blue one year. Why was it blue? Do we know?
No,
M&M sponsorship deal. Do we know why?
A different network, perhaps, Sam.
I think you were hosting the blue one, weren't you, Tim?
No, don't identify me with that, Jake.
Yeah. Well, I'd be interested in Peter's view on this. I mean, you see the Brownlow, and there's this emphasis on the women being dressed up, etc. And you're involved in football at the actual football end, and here you see women being seen as appendages to footballers. So how do you react to that?
Yeah, you're probably asking the wrong woman, because I'm not on the shoulder of an AFL player. I'm the one actually giving some of the, or barking some of the instructions or the development that goes on. So, look, I think the women or the wives or the wags or whatever it is that we call ourselves in such situations, for them it's just a night, I think, to be included, to be involved, and a chance for them to go out and buy an expensive dress and feel good and do what women like to do in that sense. But I don't think it's any exploitation of them in terms of, I think the AFL has come a long way in promoting women in football, promoting their need. They're promoting how important they actually are to the game. And I love going to. I went to the JJ Liston on Monday night, and I loved going out and buying a dress and getting dressed up and going to it and watching the Port Melbourne boys get voted for.
Tim, how many have you been to the Brownlow?
Oh, I've been to a few Brownlows, Sam, over the years. Yeah, always behaved myself. Don't think I've blotted my copybook.
Yeah, well, you probably didn't go to Drew, so.
Well, that's always a good start. Incidentally,
or Fev.
Yeah, just on. Jake's analysis of the football side of the Brownlow, a real problem for the Brownlow medal, and probably for the MVP as well, although the MVP is far more capable of throwing up a winner other than a midfielder. But the whole thing has become so dominated by one category of player that you could almost, before the season started, do a short list of 10 or a dozen players from whom the winner was going to come. And just a little exercise I did 2 or 3 years ago was to compare the career total votes Matthew Scarlett had accumulated with the number of votes Dane Swan had scored that year when he won the Brownlow. And in fact, Swan in 1 year was ahead of Scarlett, arguably the greatest fullback in history over an entire career. Now, there's got to be something hopelessly wrong with that. That's just not a modern phenomenon, incidentally, because...
That's interesting too, just on that, Tim, because I spoke to a pretty well-known Geelong official who, a few years back, and he said to me that Matthew Scarlett was the best player that he had been associated with, and he'd been associated with both Abletts. at Geelong. He was the best player that he had been around at Geelong and seen at Geelong. So he put him in, and I said, well, you're saying he's better than both of the Ablets? And he said, well, in terms of what he meant for the team and in terms of his ability to influence games, yes, he was.
I think that goes back to what I was saying about influence in the game. And the way we deal with it at Port is we actually have to vote on every player, every game, somewhere between 1 and 4. And, you know, you can have 3 or 4 players get 4 votes if you think that they've had equal influence on the game. So quite often, you know, we had a midfielder win it last year, but the 2 years before that we had a defender win it. So it, you know, seems to open it up a little bit when you have to vote on every single player.
Just with that voting system, what do you have to do to get 0?
Yeah.
Do you hear
an
me
absolute
out?
shocker.
Yeah.
Probably, or get stretched off in the first 10 or 15 minutes.
Wow, that seems harsh to get 0. Not even your fault. Do you? If I know it's an old one, and I don't know. We're just going to turn it into SEN talkback. But if the fairest was ever taken from the Brown, well, one is, do you think it'll ever happen? You made a good point too, Tim. Is that is not a new phenomenon about defenders not getting votes. The first thing I learned ever was that Merv Keane had, never got a Brownlow vote or had got one, which really impressed my mum and dad when I came home from school, and I said I'd learnt that at prep. But will it ever change, and what do you think would happen if it did?
This is the
fairest
element.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit like Australia becoming a republic, and they're saying it won't happen while the Queen's still on the throne. And while old Coco's still around, I don't reckon it'll happen, because he's quite deservedly a significant figure in the game still. He's not an unintelligent man. And the idea of a Brownlow medalist saying he would hand his back, I think, is a very telling factor, and something that the AFL needs to consider. But yeah, look, it could happen. Maybe it just becomes titular, and I think today it basically is a title. I mean, you do have the issue this year, I guess, of the Jobe Watson part of what has happened with Essendon, and that is a very curly issue, which I think the AFL has basically turned a blind eye to because it's been too hard. But I wrote an article about it in the middle of the season after Jobe had indicated that he did believe he'd taken AOD 9604, which WADA says is banned. So it raises questions about fairest and best. I went to the dictionary, and fairest referred to equitability. If you're talking equitability, and if there is the question of someone, even quite innocently and unwittingly, and it's possible that Jobe and other Essendon players could be judged in that way, but if a person had unwittingly been playing with performance-enhancing drugs having been administered to them, well, you can't really argue that they're performing equitably with the rest of the field. So I guess, when you think about it in that way, there is still a case for fairest being there, titular or not.
I'm just glad you explained what titular means. I've never heard that word before.
Drew's not here, Sam.
Well, at one point also there was a fairest view that you had to have fair hair to get a Brownlow vote, and we did have the.
See, I'm before that.
Well, we had the phenomenon of players of certain appearance who drew votes, and I often wondered whether players who looked similarly would get a vote one for the other. There's the famous story of the I think, Tim, of the Lord twins, where allegedly Alistair Lord won the Brownlow in, I think, 1962 or 63, and his twin brother Stuart took the rap for an incident where Alistair clocked someone, and allegedly Alistair escaped by saying it would be like Chris Scott, sort of the doppelganger effect of saying he did it, not him, except that unlike the Scots, these guys were relatively fair. So, yeah.
I just noticed, by the way, if you or Tim ever get in any trouble, you could probably do a similar thing, by the way. Yeah. Just for those up at the
Go
back.
to the same bar.
I think you've only got 15 years on me, Tim, so thanks, then.
But Peter, how was that being at Port Melbourne this year, was it just discussed a lot or not at all, or?
Well, the best and fairest?
No, we've moved on. We're going the Essendon stuff.
No, not really. I mean, obviously, when it came out and there was a lot more stringent processes put in place by the from AFL Victoria, and they come down and give you your usual drug and alcohol type sessions, but the importance behind it was certainly elevated and created a lot of discussion amongst the players. But I guess the sad thing is, while the discussions were being created, that it often left the players actually leaving the place confused about what is going on, what's not going on, what's correct, what, who can they trust and who can't they trust. So, in that respect, I think it just created a lot of confusion, and unfortunately, these guys who play part-time football for the love of the sport are still open and subjected to that type of testing. And it was interesting enough that last week when we played the semi-final, and we have a few boys actually going on to retire, that there was a SARTA down there taking all the blood tests of quite a lot of these boys. So you just wonder where the significance of that is when it's the last game they're ever going to play anyway, and if they were really serious, it should have been done a little bit more throughout the season rather than just at the end.
And there was a VFL player disqualified, wasn't there? There's been quite a bit of discussion about it because WADA actually came over the top, didn't they, and challenged the penalty that he was originally given. Yeah,
there was a Frankston player, and there was also there was one from, is it Casey, I think?
Yeah, the one from Casey, and there was one, I'm not sure whether it was the Frankston or the Casey one. I think it would have been the Frankston.
It was the package, the one who got the package.
He ordered online and it was intercepted at customs, so it wasn't that he actually got it or used it, and he was ordering supplements and so forth. And he, I had a conversation with him, and it cost him a fortune in legal fees, and in the end he just took the time of 2 years banned, and and he didn't inject it, he didn't take it, he didn't grab it, it was ordered online, and that was it. And so sometimes you wonder where the fairness is in that.
I do with any athlete that tests positive for drugs, I don't know if your experience is, but once they call for the B sample, I always think it's all over after that. I don't think any of the B samples ever saved anyone, has it?
I don't think the B's ever not matched the A. Yeah, I don't know why they call it a B. They might as well just call it a second sample. Covering the Essendon story has been interesting in the sense that it's introduced a lot of fairly science illiterate football writers to the term peptides. So we all went and I said, I hear they've had peptides, and we all get to Google straight away peptides. That's the first thing you do is Google it, and then you have to go and ask ring about 5 people and say, how do these things work and what do they do, and in some cases, some of the older members of staff, where can I get them?
Or maybe that beauty drug that James Hird take.
Sorry?
Maybe the beauty drug that James Hird was told to have taken.
He was taking an anti-obesity drug, wasn't he?
No. He's the tanning. I think it was called someone in the office said that it increases libido, causes a tan, and strips weight off. And they said, well, what's the problem with this? Those of us who are...
Customers had better watch out if that's the case.
I'm sure that as soon as that was written, that I'm sure that the drug sales would have increased rapidly.
Tim, in terms of coverage of that, it's just great that I've finally got a chance to ask you this in front of all these people, but what did you make of the coverage of the Essendon story? Because it was the blackest day in sport. I don't know if you're aware of that, Tim.
Well, yeah. Where do we start? I mean, we've got limited time, Sam, and I could give you an answer that probably would still be going when we got to our close down time here. Because
just unlike your article on The Age, you're not getting paid by the work, Tim. So
no, that's true. Yes. Blackest day in Australian sport for a start. I'll comment upon that because when Richard Ings, the former head of ASADA, used that expression back on, I think it was the 5th of February, wasn't it, Jake?
Yep, that's right.
Sort of goes down in the annals a bit like September 11, which is the date today.
Well, not only that, but Ings is the former head of ASADA. And it
He
was
got done
funny
for
how
drugs.
it's funny how he managed to be the person saying this is the blackest day, and it's like he wasn't actually the authority in that.
No, he wasn't, but he was made one by the media because we were always looking for a
Good grab.
a significant voice, Jake, and he was, someone who brought a credential to it, I guess. At the time, I thought it was anything but the blackest day because, in fact, I remember when I was in Seoul when Ben Johnson was caught, and I felt this was a great day for sport, that a red-hot cheat had been nailed and that this was a starting point and that these captures were really important to the well-being of sport. So when something like that happened in team sport in Australia, I felt it was a breakthrough day. Now that I look back on what's happened over the last, 7.5 months, I do begin to wonder. And why I wonder is that I do wonder whether in the end we're going to have skimmed across the top of this with a mentality of damage minimisation, a forethought both at the central administration, probably of both football codes that are caught up in it, and the football clubs involved. And there is reason too and Caroline Wilson, who's been criticised by a lot of people for being too close to the AFL in terms of the reportage she's provided in this, wrote about 3 or 4 weeks ago now, deep into an article, and only if you sort of went to the continued part inside the back page and read all the way down did you get to this, that the AFL, with Essendon under David Evans, had worked vigorously, a word she used, with federal government officials and ASADA to make sure that players were absolved in this. Now, I just failed to see what the AFL's role in doing that legitimately was. I don't think Essendon had a legitimate role in doing that. I don't think federal government officials had a legitimate role in doing that. I always imagined that ASADA and other anti-doping organisations around the world worked independently. And questions that actually challenge the independence of ASADA are questions which cause me to think perhaps this has been a very black chapter in Australian sport. Now, I don't know, but what I do know is I'd be deeply concerned if ASADA acted in anything but a totally independent way in this. And if it didn't, that is a black chapter in Australian sport.
Jake?
Yeah, look, I think a couple of things, interesting points on I agree with a lot of what Tim said. I think one thing that happened when that Black Day happened is that on one hand, I agree with Tim that it was a great thing to have the whole issue of performance-enhancing drugs opened up, because I've had a frustration, and I think Tim has as well, that there'd been so much emphasis on players, what they do recreationally in their spare time in taking illicit drugs. Now, it's not a good idea to take illicit drugs, obviously, but I think you've got to ask yourself, what's the appropriate role of a sporting body? Is it to police players' private lives? I don't happen to think it is. However, anything that smacks of cheating, I think, must be policed. And I feel that, it's like a political party. You can choose an issue, how hard you go on it. And in the public's mind, unfortunately, and in some of the correspondence that I get, there's great confusion about performance-enhancing drugs, and there's a lot of conflating between performance-enhancing drugs, like the peptides, etc., and recreational drugs or illicit drugs, which are actually, and it's even more complicated given that the performance-enhancing drugs are often legally, you can take them, you can legally buy them on the internet, but they are banned for the sport, whereas the other ones are not. I thought that the other thing we saw these Labor Party politicians, I think it was Jason Clare, was that the fellow at the front, and the sports minister, Kate Lundy. I mean, they seemed themselves to be almost anabolic in terms of their response. They were so, it is cheating, we will hunt them, we will get them. It was like George W. Bush in front of over the rubble of at 9/11. It was so over the top in the way they spoke about it, and I sensed that at this moment, sport could become a law and order issue, Tim. but I got the sense that there was actually potentially we could come up to an election. Now, I've wondered all through this, would Essendon and this whole story become an election issue? Instead, I think it's going to probably end up as a mini-series with, as someone said to me, who would play Steve Dank, and I think anyway, I'll leave that to others.
In terms of Kate Lundy, and you're saying on the anabolic steroids, they must have taken some beta blockers towards the end, because they'd certainly calmed down on their approach and their impact and the way that they went about it.
I just thought they were a little bit, I thought they were making a lot of political capital, and it got a little bit lost, the actual message, and this was a report on it. I thought that if it was handled in a less opportunistic way, I thought it would have been better.
Do you think that, you talk about policing, Jake, and then back to the best and fairest, and then of course that does, I think, naturally lead itself to the old one about role models. If they're not role models, do they need to be policed off the field? Has anything changed in that regard? Versus 2013 versus any time in the past, Tim, do you think that's changed or changing?
Whether
players are role models anymore?
Well, they are, because they...
Do you think they know they are?
They wish they weren't. I think they accept that they are. You know, kids will mimic sports people, and so I guess in this era in which sports people are so visible, so ubiquitous, sports administrators feel some sense of responsibility to impress upon the performers that they are under the eye of impressionable young people, and that therefore they should think before they act. Despite what John Kennedy said all those years ago. He said it the other way around, didn't he? Don't think, do.
Yeah, I thought Chris Judd made interesting comments a few years back to say that players are not role models, and he said that it should be parents, it should be teachers, and I thought Judd's comments were spot on, albeit the reality is that being a role model, you don't choose to be, people choose you. So that's the unfortunate fact of it. But it's like a lot of things. Going back on the drug thing, just to tie it to the role model thing.
You love talking about the drugs, don't you?
Yeah, no, I do. Yeah.
I think
that we have this surreal thing in football where people look at people because they have an ability to play a sport well, and in particular football, and we imbue them with qualities that really have no bearing on anything else. They're just good at football. But we think, and this goes to the appointment of coaches, Tim. I mean, we have the three best midfielders of their generation, or were all more or less at the same time appointed as AFL coaches, when in fact two of them are not coached at all, in James Hird and Michael Voss. One is now gone, one has come into a lot of trouble, and I think right this week we've seen Nathan Buckley, who had a 2-year apprenticeship, having quite a few problems.
Hey, Peter, I was going to ask you at the outset, who's your most admired footy coach?
Probably have to be Paul Roos.
Right. And why is that?
I think just the way he goes about his work, the way that he has created the culture at the Sydney Swans, and the fact that it's still existing while he's no longer there. The Sydney Swans, a little bit like Collingwood have as well, they've gone against the draft system in terms of, they've been able to win premierships but still sustain development so that they're still playing in finals footy. And I think the way that they've fired the draft is because of the culture which the coach, I think, ultimately takes responsibility for. So
3 votes to Roos. Who are your 2 and 1? And fairness doesn't come into this.
Look, I think I like the way that both of the Scott brothers handle themselves. I think that they're very open and honest, and I think in football you've got to be able to call a spade and be able to still get the best out of people, and they've managed to do that. Mick Malthouse, probably more so with his work at Collingwood. Again,
he's doing all right at Carlton, don't worry about that.
Well, he is now, isn't he? Again, just his ability to keep developing and defy the draft, I think speaks volumes about what they're doing at the clubs.
And what about Brendan McCartney? Because, here we've got a bloke in that rare position of having come to it, and you're a Bulldog supporter,
yes,
and without a pedigree as a an
I'm
elite
actually a
level
St
player.
Kilda supporter,
And what's that?
I'm actually a St Kilda supporter.
Oh, sorry.
But that's okay. No, I've got a soft spot for
So
the
you've still
Bulldogs.
suffered, but just in a different
I've
way.
suffered big time. But
Do the Western Bulldogs know that you barrack for St Kilda, Peter?
sorry.
The Western Bulldogs know that you barrack for St Kilda?
Yeah, but they bought my boy a little Western Bulldogs jumper, which I have to wash every second day, and you know. But if you ask him who he barracks for, he says the Saints, but he sings the Bulldogs song, so he's like a lot of the people in the football world, confused. But with Brendan McCartney, look, you know, obviously I deal at a VFL level, so I don't have a lot to do at an AFL level. Mark Niall, he enabled me to go to Melbourne to do a little bit of voluntary development work last year, which you know, I thought was a credit to him and his willingness to open his football club up, because football clubs are such closed environments that, you know, intellectual property is everything, and as a result they don't like to develop people outside their club. But having said that, you know, I'm meeting up with Brendan McCartney next Friday to have a bit of a chat about my coaching and possibly see where that could go. So he might become my new favourite coach.
Sure.
What did the three of you make about the? Because I thought it was great. I was so excited when I heard that Paul Roos was announced as the Melbourne coach. What did you make of the press conference? Because the bit I saw, he seemed to very quickly be talking about what was going to be happening after he left. It was like a domestic flight from Adelaide to Melbourne. You were up and they were already talking about, well, you know, get ready for landing. It just seemed it was happening rather quickly that he was. I hope he stays there forever. But
Well, actually, while you were out here doing the introductions and we were around the back, we were talking about this, and I asked of Jake, how many years do you reckon he'll coach them for?
Well, I said 2 because that's what he said. So I can only go on and...
So the option's not going to be exercised? Just
Well, maybe it will, but the only thing that struck me was, what if they haven't got the suitable person to be the underling as well? I mean, they've got to find this because he's been in Sydney, and obviously there was this handover to John Longmire, which was extremely benign, as distinct from the Collingwood handover, because Mick was obviously very reluctant and saw him as really he saw Collingwood as sacking him, whereas Roosie was a very willing handover, and in this case it seemed like he handed over before he'd got it.
Peter, what did you?
overlap.
Yeah, what do you think about succession plans as a coach?
Yeah, look, I think if you've developed the right partnership, well, you know, I think it's a win-win for the club, because in any, whether it's a footy club or a classroom, whenever you get a new coach or a new club, there is a period of not downtime, but a period of learning about your players and what they can do. So you almost lose time. So, and Melbourne are okay because, you know, a lot of their players will be young, but if you had a list with a couple of people that, you know, that don't have a long time, well, you can't afford to lose that time. So therefore, to hand it down to in a succession plan, you're saving on that and building on what's already been there. And I think in anything, in particular football, you know, to be able to have sustainability or stability is probably 2 key factors to achieving success, and succession plans go to those 2 points.
We will be opening up for any questions from the audience if you have them. Of course, Tim Lane, the doyen. Peta Searle is a current day coach, and of course I didn't mention that Jake Niall was the senior sports writer at The Age. I did ask a good friend of mine on the way here, Adam Zwar, a former journo at the Herald Sun, because we've never met Jake. I said, what do you know about Jake Niall? And he goes, Jake Niall, he follows me on Twitter. So high praise indeed from Adam there, I thought. Well, Jake, that's if you'd like to ask a man who follows Adam Zwar on Twitter any question at all about football, you'll have an opportunity, and one of the ushers can come around and hand you a microphone. Tim?
Jake is a Collingwood man, incidentally.
Well, you've kept that quiet,
Now,
Jake.
I'm sure there are plenty of Collingwood people out there and they want to know exactly where this club is at, Jake. I want to know too.
Well, it's funny because
I'm happy where they are right now.
One thing struck me about Collingwood vis-a-vis Carlton, your team, Tim, is that if you go back to 2006, I probably should have already written this, but if you go back to 2006, Mick Malthouse was the coach of Collingwood. Greg Swan was the CEO. The head of fitness was David Butterfint, and the star new recruit was Dale Thomas. Now, you could end up with a clean sweep of all those positions, which personally I feel a very troubling thing about modern footy is the exchangeability of identities. And I reckon that the biggest danger, people talk about clubs being what's the biggest problem facing footy. To me, one of the things that I'm probably the only person that seems to care about it is the blurring of the professionalism driving a system whereby it's like a fantasy league where everyone swaps, players swap, coaches swap. I think David Whedon has actually coached nearly every Victorian club as an assistant. So
Jake,
how do you feel about that, Tim? Do you see Carlton and you see Mick as the coach, Swanee as the CEO, and these are good operators, and then you've got potentially Dale Thomas coming in. He may not, but he looks like it's a chance. David Butterfint. You've got Gavin Brown, who is a great... So you've got... it's really...
Jake, are you saying that Eddie Maguire is going to be the next president of Carlton? Is that what you just said?
Well, I might barrack for Carlton now. I mean, I might as well.
Let's not go too far, Sam. I'm actually warming to the idea up to a point. But there is a good case for the weekend having been the greatest in the history of the Carlton Football Club. And in fact, if you go back another week... by beating Port Adelaide by 1 point, Carlton knocked North Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide out of the game. And then on the weekend, they took Essendon's spot, they eliminated Richmond, and they went past Collingwood. This is like a wrecking ball going through an old building.
Not only that, but they had that cunning plan to finish ninth and get in on a by another team being rubbed out.
Jake, not many teams win the flag for finishing outside the top four. Carlton are trying to win it from finishing outside the eight. So that will be history in the making from Mick. Just before we do go to the audience, any other than the Essendon story, which just dominated everything, your biggest football story so far of the year, Peter?
Oh, gee, that's going to take a little bit to think about, isn't it? For me, being a bit of an ambassador for women's football, it's definitely the first women's AFL sanctioned game between the Western Bulldogs and Melbourne Football Club, and the fact that there was 7,500 people there to watch the game, which is more than what was at the Western Bulldogs and GWS game. So if that doesn't say something to AFL in terms of promotion and participation, and there's 4 areas of participation they need to tick off, and women's footy is one of them. To me, it just makes a marketing sense.
Better standard of football at your game as well. That should be noted. Tim.
Oh, it's a big question, Sam. And off the top of my head, I'm not really sure what to say. I think the arrival of Fremantle as a force, and that Ross Lyon he is a formidable character, Peter. I mean, among the coaches, there's no one who puts his stamp on a team quite like he does, I don't think. Yeah,
his preparation is just outstanding, and his hard work, and he demands that of everyone that comes in contact with him. And he says that if you're not a tired coach, well, then you obviously haven't been putting in enough of the workload. So, if you take that type of work ethic and tick all the boxes as he does, and able to connect and bring the best out of people, which he seems to be able to take a footballer and get them to play a certain way that makes it fit for the team, and that obviously then makes the team perform better. I think he does that better than any other coach, and that's why it's only taking a year and a bit for Fremantle to be a force. And probably what's more scary is not what they achieved this year, but what they're going to achieve in subsequent years.
And not unconnected to that, I reckon we started the year talking about the haves and the have-nots, and the crisis that was emerging of the struggling Victorian clubs in particular, but one or two interstaters as well. Port Adelaide, boy, aren't they struggling, and Brisbane, who nearly made the 9. So they seem to have come good, those two, fairly rapidly, and I think there's something in that. I think actually we're seeing a swing back now after a few years of plenty for the Victorian clubs, to a point where the non-Victorian clubs, and there are 3 of them in the last 6, which means they're playing above their weight, particularly if you don't include GWS and Gold Coast, which haven't arrived yet. They're still fledglings. So I think we're actually seeing the non-Victorian clubs, well-resourced as they are, start to strike back.
I think the good luck story with Port Adelaide too looks at Ken Hinkley as their coach. He's probably done the assistant coach tradesmanship for the longest period of time, and has definitely deserved his gig at a head coach. And to put that into perspective to what you were saying before about James Hird, Nathan Buckley and Michael Voss, who were superstars of the game, and therefore that makes them equivalent to be a head coach, I think it goes to show that you need more than being a superstar, and you need to be able to do the work and learn the caper. And I think it's a good story for Port Adelaide, but it's also a good story for Ken Hinkley.
Absolutely. That window of being an assistant coach can go on too long, by the way, too. I think there was a time during in the last 10 years when Brian Royal was going to coach every team, and Chris Bond as well. And yet, and they've disappeared. They're still in the game, but a head coaching job seems unlikely for them. Jake, other than the S&B stories,
I think Melbourne in two ways. Melbourne Football Club, one being the state of a club where you can have a club that is basically below the competition in the space of a year on the field. Somehow this club, despite having early draft picks, despite all these things that happen and all the professionalism, why this team couldn't win and couldn't even... And that we were almost watching games wondering, can they get within 10 goals? Can they actually... And I found every game that I saw Melbourne play, I wanted them to do well. It didn't matter who they were playing, and it was like watching a fighter who can't raise his hands. That's how I saw them, and I thought it was terrible. I'm rapt that Paul Roos has at least come in and given that club hope. But the other point being that Melbourne came out of the tanking investigation. And the tanking, I think the 2 big stories, it's within the last 12 months that we've had tanking and we've had the Essendon thing. We've got on one hand a club that did whatever it takes to win, and we've got a club that did whatever it took to lose. So we've seen these 2 off-field stories, one a very well-resourced club that was doing that, and one a not-so-well-resourced club. But I think that the Melbourne Football Club, which is the oldest football club in the land, and I think they say in the world, don't they, Tim? They claim that the Melbourne Footy Club is the oldest. And we'll see what happened to that football club. And in the end, it's essentially now in what I would call an AFL receivership. So the AFL have stepped in and they've decided who's going to be, more or less, who's going to be on the board. They've decided they have a power of veto over the coach. The only way that Paul Roos is coaching that club on an estimated, well over $1 million, maybe 1.5, is because the AFL's funding it. So I think Melbourne, in many ways, has been a bigger story than Essendon. It's not, but it is really quite extraordinary what's happened at that club.
Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, up the back. Oh, here first. Here we go.
To Jake Niall. Jake, as a commentator of AFL, and each year teams that are bundled out, so in the first week, all the other teams that did make the finals, they've got to go through their reviews and decide who goes on into the next season or not. In your experience, is there any way or better way in handling, club champions that have sort of come to an end and that they must be moved on, even though they don't want to be moved on?
Yeah, it's.
I'm thinking of Collingwood in particular.
You think of Alan Didak and Darren Jolly and earlier in the year Ben Johnson, and you think of. Some of these Geelong players I'm particularly thinking of. You'd wonder what is going to happen to Joel Corey and Paul Chapman. These guys are fantastic players. I think of the Geelong players particularly because for Geelong to have had the success that they've had to forego a bit of money, I think. So it comes to the point. Does the Geelong Footy Club owe, if Paul Chapman has sacrificed a bit of money in order to be, for that club to be successful, let's say $50,000 a year, do they owe him another year in a contract? Do they owe him a year? Do they owe Joel Corey a year? what do football clubs owe to these players who've given them such great service? I always thought it was a great thing about Carlton, Tim, that I reckon Carlton gave their champion players the gold watch year. I reckon you got the extra year.
Just nudged the salary cap up a little bit.
Just nudged it up. I think I heard Eddie Maguire calling one of
very
those
altruistic person, John Elliott.
That's right. There was a game. I think one of those charity games where some of the old Carlton players were playing to raise money when they were broke. And I think Eddie called the game and he said this guy's still being paid. I think he was talking about some of the 1970s players.
I think if it was up to Tim and I, Bruce Doyle would still be on the senior list at Carlton, wouldn't he, Tim?
Yeah. But the answer to your question, there's no good way. I think it's like ending a relationship. There is no good way to tell someone they're sacked, and whether that's a coach or whether that's a player. And you always hear people say, it's not that they did it, it's the way it was done. No, it's the fact that it was done.
Very good point. Yes, the side there.
Jake, why would you need to speculate as to who would play Stephen Dank in the mini-series? Stephen Curry is the image of him. He just needs to bulk up a bit, and Stephen Dank may be able to help him with that, don't you think?
That's a good...
Can I ask a second question just before you answer that one? With this whole Essendon saga, why is Caroline Wilson being more demonised than James Hird?
I'll answer the Dank question first. Someone suggested to me Anthony Hopkins, actually, but I think that's a bit harsh on Steve. I think on the harshness on Caro, I agree with you that she has. I know firsthand because I've been involved in covering this as well. And the thing I can compare it to is other journalists who have also been hard. I've been reasonably hard, nowhere near as hard as Caro, but I've copped nothing like. I've copped a bit of flack, but nothing like what she cops. And I would also add Patrick Smith has been equally hard on the Essendon Footy Club in this. And coming from a similar place to Caroline, and I don't think he's copped anything like that. Unfortunately, I think, without getting into a very complicated gender discussion, but I think there are parallels with some would say Julia Gillard, but I would actually say Christine Nixon, where people see appropriate gender roles and inappropriate gender roles. But it's a very complex subject which we could go on with for hours, and I think that's the short of it.
Just another offering on the actor for Stephen Dank. I read the other day heard that Jack Nicholson is giving it away because he's suffering from memory loss. He might be perfect for the role.
I think the bigger question with Jack, by the way, is when he is gone, who takes those seats at courtside at the Lakers games? I don't know who they're going to replace him with. Any other questions for the esteemed panel?
Team in Tasmania, is that going to happen?
Oh, who could answer that?
Peter, what do you think? Do you think there should be one?
Be careful what you say here, Peter.
Look, I don't think it's going to happen for some time. The AFL have got to get right what they've got happening now, and I think throughout the course of this year they've shown there's certainly aspects that they haven't got right, and probably to go a little bit along with what I was saying before with some stability. I think the AFL needs stability and a little bit of integrity back in what they've already got existing, and perhaps further developing, looking after clubs such as Melbourne, making sure that the GWS and Gold Coast are competitive, but also looking out for the other clubs such as St Kilda and so forth. But I think they've got to get the teams that they've got in the competition right before they go elsewhere and include another one.
Tim, is it as simple as this? Are Tasmania being punished for having too much support of the game?
Well, it's a bit like that. Their support is being taken for granted. And in fact, what the AFL is failing to realise is that Tasmania, if given the encouragement, would again begin to produce great footballers hand over fist. I really believe that. When I was a kid back in the 60s, Tassie had no cricketers, but was a first-class state, even though it wasn't in the Sheffield Shield. When touring teams, as they did when they were out here, played a game or two in Tassie, they were first-class matches. And it used to be embarrassing to watch because Tassie would be knocked over for 65 in the first innings and follow on, 350 behind, and the bowlers of the touring team would go easy on them in the second innings and they'd make about 120. So Tassie were a mile off the pace, and it was a giant leap of faith for the Australian Cricket Board, as it was known back then, to include Tasmania initially on a part-time basis. They played only half the games each, so 5 out of 9. They only played the other states once when they first came in. And in the early years, it was really tough going. But look at what has happened since. Tassie have won the Shield 3 of the last 5 or 6 years, produced the greatest modern-day batsman in Australia. David Boone would be in the top 5 or 6 over the last 25 years. Ben Hilfenhaus, good contributor. Matthew Wade's at Tasmania. Now, it's becoming a tremendous source of outstanding Australian cricketers, and that would happen with football again, because football is the natural game of Tasmania, and if Tasmanians were given their own team, they would surprise themselves in terms of the ferocity with which they supported it and the rapidity with which they jumped off their current support for Collingwood and Essendon and Carlton.
And would you renounce the Blues at that point?
I would, yeah. Yep. I would. I'd have to now. I've committed myself too heavily. I'd have no choice. What went on in my head would be another matter, but no, I would feel very passionately about the Tasmanian team.
Perhaps President, Tim?
Oh, well, I don't know, cheerleader I think might be the go, Sam. And look, the AFL have taken them for granted. And unfortunately, they've painted themselves into a corner, because I think there is probably a lot of discomfort now at the fact that it has become something of a cause. And it's interesting that it always bobs up in question time at gatherings such as this, because I think people in Victoria feel a sense of injustice about it. And whereas once upon a time I was inclined to think it was just a matter of time, I still believe it'll happen. I'm sure it'll happen. My concern is now that it might not happen in my lifetime, Sam. But then again, that might be because I sort of fall under a bus when I leave here tonight or something like that.
I will have one more question. I did enjoy, Tim, your summation of Tassie cricket in the last 25 years. Ricky Ponting, champion. David Boone, legend. Hilfenhaus, good contributor. So that's... sure he'll be rapt to hear that. Yes, one more here on the end.
Just coming back to the Brownlow, the question of who should be allocating the votes, given that umpires are officiating, and the anachronisms in some of the Brownlow results, the point you made about Matty Scarlett, and then you see players like Corey Enright win their club best and fairest in an amazing team. It just seems to me very strange that the umpires are the ones allocating the votes.
Yes, but I like the fact that it's the umpires allocating the votes, and everything you say is true. It doesn't vary that much really from the media awards. There's always that potential in the Brownlow for a surprise, like Shane Woden was, I think from memory, given some sort of chance. He was a little bit of a shock. I can remember when Paul Kelly won the Brownlow in 1995. I think in a way there's been a couple of results where someone's either polled really well or won the Brownlow, and they've been recognised subsequently. The umpires found that player was better than everyone realised. I think Paul Kelly was a great example of that.
Liberatore similarly.
And I think there was another... I think Dane Swan, there was that year where Dane was probably with the rest of the Rat Pack at Collingwood, and their season had finished, and he was wearing a Spider-Man outfit and some flippers on a drinking binge, and he hadn't actually gone to the Brownlow. He wasn't invited, and he was leading it. I think it was the year that Bartel won. So, yeah, I think you're right about Corey Enright's. I think Cameron Ling recently said he was the best player apart from Gary Ablett that he'd played with at Geelong, and yeah, he's not going to get Brownlow votes. But it was ever thus.
The Wheeler Centre events, they finish on time, unless there's one quick question. Yes.
Dead heat.
Yeah, you.
I understand that women's sport makes up about 2 to 3% of major newspaper coverage. Do the panellists think that's okay, or even just in relation to football? And what, if not, then what could be done to change that?
Fire away, Peter. You go first.
You guys are in the papers.
You can answer
you give
that
it to me. Look, I think it's a bit of a vicious circle in terms of, what the media reports is what makes money. What makes money is what sponsors give. So you've got this cycle that's going around, and you need somebody to jump off that cycle and invest. And once you do that, once, say, a major company did that, well, then I think it would snowball. It will snowball because it would start that cycle going, and it will snowball because no one else wants to miss out, so they'll get on board. But it's a little bit like me getting into the AFL, I guess. It's waiting for somebody to take that, well, what other people seem a chance, but for what women think is a right. But until that happens, it's probably going to continue to go down the path that it is at.
And look, I think I don't want to be too defensive, it's not just a gender issue. There are other men's sports which don't get much coverage either. Men's hockey doesn't get a lot of coverage in the paper. Lacrosse doesn't get a lot of coverage in the paper. It's about the perceived relativity of interest and what will actually drive sales, I guess. I mean, in the end, always back self-interest.
Yeah, it's commercial. It's a commercial thing, and it's not. Doesn't mean it's right. It's just what it is, unfortunately. But I think that there was a big step taken when Channel 10 started to televise netball. I think because netball's the one sport where you see that the grassroots of it are so strong, but that's not reflected in the mass audience. If you look at American football in the United States, that's a sport that's not that great grassroots-wise, but it's like a gladiator sport. And I've often wondered whether football, AFL as it's now known, interestingly, we use the brand name of the competition to describe the sport now, like Hoover, that AFL is could, if the grassroots withers, could become a sport which is played by these incredible athletes, but wither at the grassroots. Netball, I would see netball as a sport with when the television started to pick up and there was a few personalities and you were hearing about it, I could see some potential, but
one thing that
it is a vicious cycle.
One thing that does hold is if it's an international sport. So women's soccer, women's basketball, women's cricket. I think
women's tennis.
Women's tennis. I think women's cricket this year has really achieved some outstanding results in terms of getting paid $10,000 for one of their tournaments, etc. And you look at the girls playing AFL, and it still costs them $400 or $500 to play, never alone to get anything back in that respect. So, if it's an international sport, it seems to have a lot more support going forward.
Our time is up, but I better quickly whip around and just get a tip for the grand final, and I know tipping is just so accountable. We're all going to come back here on the Monday after the grand final, and you can all just judge us then on our tips. But Jake, grand final, Premier?
Grand final, Dockers clearly versus Hawks to win.
Peter?
Yeah, I will go on to Fremantle as well. Or generally speaking, great grand final teams have a very strong defensive element, and the Dockers have certainly got that.
Tim, just before I ask you, I wanted to say that growing up listening to you as a small boy on the ABC, it is a big privilege to be on the stage with you, and of course you're with 3AW now. I just wanted a quick question. Does a little bit of you die inside every time you have to give away a Bataki ham?
I think that you actually gave my friend a Bataki ham.
What was that, Pete?
I think you actually gave my friend a Bataki ham.
Did I? I think a little bit of you dies whenever you eat a Bataki ham.
It was when I first got appointed at at Port Melbourne, and it was whoever knew Peta Searle to ring up, and you got a Petoki ham. So, nevertheless, they got the Petoki ham, and we ate it all camping. Thank you.
What was the talkback topic? If you know Peta Searle, ring up and you get a Petoki ham.
That's correct.
Another cracking production meeting for you there, Tim, before the show.
I thought it might have been the Petoki we give away for the Sunday roast. And we also give away a lithium-ion cordless drill courtesy of the Zito. Give it a go with the Zito. There you go, Sam. I've learnt the lines off pretty well at this stage. Yeah. We've got to be flexible, and we've got to be young and able to, change our habits, I guess. Perhaps.
Forgive me. I apologise for that. It was meant with respect. What about your
grand final?
I'm
going to tip Freo to win it because I think there's certainties to be there, and Hawthorn probably will have to play Geelong in a preliminary final, so I'm just not sure who Fremantle's opponent will be, and therefore I'm not prepared to select anyone from that side of the draw to win the flag. Dockers for me.
Amazing that Hawthorn are just one loss away from Jeff Kennett calling for Alistair Clarkson to be sacked, by the way. Everyone should remember. Do you remember that? That was the round one this year. That was, it seems like a long time ago.
I think Jeff was tired and emotional that night.
Understandably. I just wanted to thank the Wheeler Centre and the Age. Thank you all for coming, but I'm sure you all want to thank Jake Niall, Peta Searle and Tim Lane for coming tonight.